I was never supposed to see the house in daylight that afternoon, never meant to feel how wrong it all was while the sun still hung high and innocent in the sky. Because according to my calendar, I should have been stuck in a meeting until evening, pretending to care about numbers that no longer mattered. Yet at 2:41 p.m., I found myself rolling into the driveway with the uneasy sense that I had walked into the wrong life. The front door slightly ajar as if the house itself had exhaled and forgotten to close its mouth, and that tiny detail hit me harder than any confession could have, because Lena had always been obsessive about locks, about routines, about controlling the smallest things to feel safe. So seeing that door unlocked felt like discovering a stranger's shoes by the bed, a quiet betrayal whispering before the shouting ever began. And when I pushed inside and called her name, my voice echoed too cleanly. Bouncing off walls that felt suddenly hollow, her purse abandoned on the counter, her phone face down like it was hiding from me, the silence growing heavier with each step until a faint sound drifted down from upstairs. A soft, cautious creak that didn't belong to settling wood or old pipes, but to someone trying desperately not to be heard. And in that moment, I understood that my life had already shifted before I even saw the proof. When I called for her again, louder, more insistent, the response came not as words but as hurried movement, footsteps scrambling, the thud of panic trying to rearrange itself before I reached the truth. And then she appeared at the top of the stairs with flushed cheeks, tangled hair, and a thin robe clinging to her like she had pulled it on in a rush, asking in a brittle voice why I was home so early, as though my presence itself was the true crime. And when I lied about a burst pipe at work, I watched her swallow the story too quickly, her eyes darting past me like she was tracking time slipping through her fingers, blocking the hallway with her body as if she could physically stop what was coming. Yet the closer I moved, the more the air seemed to vibrate with secrets. And when I noticed the bedroom closet door swinging slightly like it had just been nudged shut, she offered excuses that felt as fragile as glass, claiming vents and drafts, while trembling in a way that told me her body had already confessed what her mouth refused to say. I passed her despite her grip on my arm and entered the room that was supposed to be our sanctuary, only to find it rearranged into chaos, sheets twisted like they had witnessed something they could not forget, pillows scattered like silent witnesses, and the closet standing there with a stillness that felt unnatural, daring me to open it, while she pleaded in a voice that sounded like it had already accepted the end. And when I pulled the door wide, I found a stranger pressed among my clothes, half-dressed, frozen mid-message on his phone, eyes wide with fear, and for a few surreal seconds none of us moved, because the truth was so loud it made us all mute, until he muttered something painfully stupid about things not being what they looked like. And I laughed, not in rage, not in heartbreak, but in that hollow way your mind laughs when reality shatters and your brain scrambles for something familiar to hold on to. I asked how long it had been happening, demanded a number like it could somehow make sense of everything, and when she whispered that it had been half a year, I realized that my relief came not from her guilt, but from the confirmation that my instincts had been right all along, because 6 months earlier something else had quietly begun in my life as well, something she never knew about, something that would eventually make this betrayal feel like a crude shortcut rather than a devastating end. And as the stranger fled my house on my command, shoes in hand, shame clinging to him like sweat, I stood in the doorway of a marriage that had already collapsed long before I arrived home early, understanding that what looked like chaos was actually the final piece of a puzzle I had been assembling in silence. Half a year before that day, my company had quietly announced a corporate acquisition that most employees treated like an inconvenient rebrand. Yet buried deep within my contract was a clause I had forgotten. A small legal trapdoor that opened the moment ownership changed hands, instantly vesting shares that had been nothing more than theoretical numbers on a screen. And when HR recited the details with mechanical calm, I nodded politely before sitting alone in my car afterward, staring at the steering wheel while my life recalculated itself around a figure so large it felt unreal, a sum that represented freedom, choice, and the terrifying clarity that comes when you realize you no longer have to accept what you once endured. And in that moment, I decided to keep that truth to myself, not out of generosity or secrecy, but because something inside me sensed that my marriage was already cracked in ways money would only expose further. I began to notice things I had previously ignored, patterns hiding behind excuses, changes disguised as self-improvement. Her sudden love for nights out, new perfume worn to places that required none, her phone angled away whenever I entered a room, and I told myself not to overthink, not to become suspicious without proof. Yet each small detail felt like a thread pulling me toward something I was not yet ready to face. And when I stumbled upon a hotel charge that did not match any believable story, I felt a cold certainty settle into my chest, not explosive, not dramatic, but steady and patient, the kind that waits for truth instead of demanding it. Rather than confronting her, I observed, quietly collecting moments the way a storm gathers clouds, using technology we had once set up for safety to map a pattern of deception that unfolded with chilling consistency, documenting dates, locations, and lies with the detached precision of someone who already knows the ending. And each new discovery didn't break me but hardened me, shaping a version of myself who no longer sought reassurance but instead prepared for escape. Backing everything up in places she would never think to look, storing the evidence like insurance for a future I had not yet chosen but knew was coming. When the acquisition finalized, and the money transferred into an account that existed solely in my name, I felt no urge to celebrate, no rush to announce my fortune, because by then the weight of her betrayal had eclipsed any thrill the numbers could offer. And instead of freedom, what I felt was clarity, the understanding that I was standing on the edge of a life that required courage to leave and discipline to rebuild. And so I met quietly with a lawyer who spoke in calm, measured sentences about timing, documentation, and patience, advising me to wait until the truth revealed itself completely before making any move that would tip my hand. For months I lived as if nothing had changed, coming home at the same time, pretending to listen, pretending to care, while she grew careless, slipping deeper into her double life, believing her secrecy still worked, unaware that every lie strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it, until the day fate forced the truth into my living room by sending me home hours early, collapsing her carefully constructed illusion with the simplest twist of timing. And as I stood in that bedroom watching the last of my old life run down the stairs, I understood that sometimes betrayal is not the end, but the permission you didn't know you were waiting for. She followed me through the house like a ghost that refused to accept it had already died, her sobs echoing off walls that suddenly felt foreign, begging me to sit, to talk, to rage, to do anything that would mean I still cared enough to fight. Yet I moved with a calm that frightened even me, opening the refrigerator, taking a drink, letting the cold bitterness settle in my chest while she demanded to know what I would do next, and when I told her I was leaving for good. Her world seemed to collapse in slow motion, her knees nearly buckling as she whispered my name like it was a spell that could still undo what she had chosen. But I felt nothing except the quiet certainty that this chapter had ended long before she ever brought another man into our bed. I packed only what I needed, not out of anger but out of respect for myself, listening to her promises dissolve into air, claims of counseling and change that sounded like echoes from a life I no longer recognized. And as I zipped my bag, I realized that forgiveness is meaningless when trust is already buried, because love cannot grow in soil poisoned by deception. And when I told her my lawyer would contact her, she looked at me as though I had transformed into someone she had never met. Which in a way was true, because grief had carved away the man who once believed her every word. Instead of hiding in a hotel, I went straight to the lawyer who had prepared me for this moment, showing him the final proof captured by chance and timing, the footage of her lover fleeing like a thief in daylight. And he nodded with a professional calm that felt almost merciful, explaining the next steps as if this were just another case, another marriage unraveling under the weight of secrets. Yet for me, it felt like stepping into a life where the rules were suddenly clear, where every choice now belonged to me alone. The paperwork moved quickly, colder and more efficient than any emotional closure could have been. And when she was served in public, the shock rippled through her carefully crafted image, forcing her to face consequences she had long postponed, calling and texting me in desperation, pleading for a conversation that would never come. Because by then my silence was not cruelty, it was protection, a boundary built from months of preparation and resolve. Her attorney tried to negotiate from a place of ignorance, unaware of the silent fortune that had already reshaped my future, and each conversation felt like watching a chess game where my opponent did not know the board had changed, because the truth is power when used with restraint. And in the end she walked away with fragments of a life she had dismantled herself, while I claimed not only my freedom, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that patience had saved me from chaos. I sold the house not because I needed the money, but because its walls carried too many memories, too many reminders of promises that had dissolved into lies, trading it for a smaller, cleaner space that felt like a blank page rather than a graveyard. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future defined not by compromise, but by choice, traveling to places I had only seen in pictures, rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried beneath obligation and routine. Time softened the sharp edges of the past, replacing anger with indifference, until one day a message arrived from the man who had once hidden in my closet, offering an apology that felt almost unnecessary, because his betrayal had merely revealed a truth that was already there. And in that moment, I realized that closure does not come from apologies, but from the decision to move forward without carrying the weight of what can no longer be changed. Years later, when someone new entered my life, she did not arrive with promises of perfection or grand illusions, but with honesty, scars, and the courage to begin again. And through quiet conversations and shared laughter, I learned that trust is not blind faith but a choice renewed daily, built on transparency rather than fear. And for the first time I felt grounded in something real, something unforced, something worth protecting. When my past eventually tried to reach me again, asking for forgiveness it did not deserve, I listened without anger, without warmth, without regret, understanding that some chapters exist only to teach you what you will no longer tolerate. And when I hung up, I felt lighter than I ever had, free not because I had won, but because I had let go. Looking back now, I see that betrayal did not destroy me. It redirected me, pushing me toward a life that demanded courage, patience, and self-respect. And while the pain once felt endless, it was merely the doorway to something better, something honest, something finally mine, because sometimes the greatest revenge is not in what you take, but in the life you choose to build when you walk away.